With sprawling galaxies to explore and an almost endless universe of things to do, Starfield is Bethesda's most ambitious game yet. But while it's been in development for 7 years, its roots can be traced back to the 1990s when Todd Howard rewrote the RPG rulebook with The Elder Scrolls 3. From Morrowind to Starfield, this is how Bethesda defined the role-playing game. In late 2001, the dot-com crash struck ZeniMax, and a team of 30-some developers in the company's basement feared for their jobs. They were late delivering their new role-playing game, The Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind, to Microsoft. Their board of directors had begun having doubts about the whole video game enterprise. People were pulling 7-day work weeks on something none of them were sure would ever see the light of day. Morale was in the toilet. When project leader Todd Howard called an off-site meeting mere months ahead of launch, most of his crew thought they were being laid off. In fact, it was the most important moment in the studio's history. Howard had sent out emails to everyone on his team days earlier asking them, if you could have any title in life, what would it be? In a dim-lit hotel conference room in Rockville, Maryland, he handed out a personalized business card to each Morrowind dev, complete with their chosen honorific, and gave a brief speech. It was a rallying call that saved the game, and according to those who were there, probably the entire company. It was a bad time, Howard said in 2019. Morrowind was very difficult crunch. There was this sense that if we don't get this game done, and done well, we would be in trouble. It had been 6 long years since the developer's last big hit, 1996 Daggerfall. He says, for me, it was kind of a no-fear moment. Well, it can't get any worse, right? We're about to go out of business, and now we have a lifeline, so you better take advantage of it. And so they reached for the stars. Morrowind became the first Elder Scrolls game to land on consoles roughly 6 months into the life cycle of the original Xbox. It sold millions on Xbox alone, rivaled only by the likes of Halo, Tom Clancy's Splinter Cell, and Fable. Howard referred to this period as the recreation of Bethesda. Its story spans nearly 4 decades, from humble beginnings in sports games and movie tie-ins to blockbusters like Skyrim and Fallout 4. But so much of that journey would never have come to pass without Morrowind, and that fateful meeting they remember so vividly.
It was kind of this galvanizing make-or-break moment that it was the crucible by which I think the modern evolution and progression of Elder Scrolls, and at that point really probably Bethesda as well.
Look at Bethesda's single-player titles from Oblivion on, and you'll find more or less the same formula Howard concocted for The Elder Scrolls 3, a game that changed RPGs forever.
They have taken you from the Imperial City's prison, first by carriage and now by boat, to the east, to Morrowind.
Years earlier, in 1994, The Elder Scrolls Arena became a cult success thanks to its playful spell creation system and effectively infinite fantasy world. But some folks at Bethesda weren't satisfied with the somewhat generic look of that first game, its limited number of memorable locations, or its derivative story, which began in the weekly Dungeons & Dragons campaign. For the sequel, originally called Mournhold and set in the province of Morrowind where Arena's story had ended, the devs had a new sense of vision for what the dungeon crawling series could be. Its first-person 3D perspective led them to push for a greater level of detail, which came in the form of their new X-Engine technology, as well as a more literary style of storytelling. Arena had been a fairly standard D&D adventure, albeit one set in an original world called Tamriel with 9 large provinces. The Elder Scrolls 2, Daggerfall, would center around 2 of these regions, High Rock and Hammerfell, and take inspiration from sources like French literature and Vampire the Masquerade, another tabletop game known for its gothic setting and rich mythology. Some of what Daggerfall's designers wanted to achieve proved untenable at the time. The team didn't manage to implement dragons the way they'd hoped, for example, but its procedural world generation system was a landmark achievement, allowing for more than 15,000 unique locations. The sequel became a huge triumph for Bethesda, selling over 100,000 copies in just 48 hours. After Daggerfall, the development arm of the company, eventually rechristened as Bethesda Game Studios, differentiated from its publishing division, would adopt a fairly different game design philosophy, particularly under Todd Howard's direction. And yet much of the studio's history reflects the awesome ambition of those early Elder Scrolls games, including this year's Starfield, which leverages procedural generation and boasts more than 1,000 explorable planets. As audiences and tech alike headed for the new millennium, the teams working on the Elder Scrolls series thought constantly about ways to make their next game better, and more like the dense, sprawling fantasy epic in their imaginations. A pair of spin-offs, Battlespire and Redguard, underperformed commercially, but Redguard in particular set a new standard for the Elder Scrolls world building. The game's print manual included the Pocket Guide to the Empire, an in-world lore bible containing references to gods, goddesses, a dragonborn, and the disappearance of the dwarves, along with an extensive history of the various peoples of Tamriel. When lead designer Ken Rolston came aboard the project in 1996, Elder Scrolls 3 was meant to be set in a place called Somerset Isles, home of the High Elves. But some people on the team, including concept artist Michael Kirkbride and writer Kurt Coleman, were passionate about the volcanic island of Vardenfell. So the idea for a game set in the land of the elves ruled by a tribunal was transplanted to Morrowind. Noah Barry recalls seeing early documentation for the Elder Scrolls 3 that described a sequel encompassing the entire territory of Morrowind.
Morrowind was a healthy pivoting away or steering away from what Daggerfall had done, because Daggerfall was largely purely procedurally generated. We consciously pivoted to, well, let's hand build the world. So Morrowind had very little to no procedural generation, if I remember correctly.
But eventually, the scope of the game was whittled down to the island of Vardenfell itself, and the surrounding areas were cut during the pre-production phase. With Rolston and Howard steering the project, the team sought to trade Daggerfall's vastness and cookie-cutter environments for a more detailed and believable world, one with several thousand lines of voiceover.
You talk too much, Outlander.
Part of the reasoning for this was the team's love for immersive sim games like Ultima Underworld and System Shock, which took advantage of the first-person perspective by giving players a greater degree of interactivity with objects in the world. The Elder Scrolls 3 took a more kitchen-sink approach to game design, favoring pixel density, character behavior, and artfully arranged clutter over scale alone. It's an approach that stood the test of time and helped define later Bethesda RPGs like Skyrim and Fallout 4. One of its greatest innovations, inspired by Ultima 7: The Black Gate, was something called NPC scheduling, the illusion that non-player characters throughout the game would live full human lives working and eating and sleeping at designated times.
We wanted it to feel like this simulated, detailed space that persisted and existed after you would shut your computer off for the night. Like it just, it felt like a real tangible place. And one of the ways at which that really came to life was this idea that NPCs were not just talking dispensers for quests, stuck in a static spot saying their lines over and over again. They were real entities that were doing their own thing as much as possible, as much as was allowed by the crudity of our navigating system, pathfinding, for example, their ability to know where they were within the polygon soup, as we used to call it.
According to Fallout 4 lead producer Jeff Gardner, it was Morrowind's sequel, Oblivion, that really put these systems to the test.
When you do a simulated AI, they use a lot of CPU cycles, right? They use a lot of your CPU, and that is where you get a lot of limits in terms of creature density. Even frame rate is oftentimes affected by that. But the folks and designers at Bethesda are very big proponents of making these NPCs feel as real as they could within the limits of the technical horsepower of the time.
I am here. I stand proud before you, city swimmer, trainer of the prospective sneaker.
And I think when you play a lot of modern open world games, they're still very scripted. Again, over time, things have gotten a little better, but they don't have these eat and sleep packages and desires and all these things that they would wake up and do. And where you see some of the most amazing interactions, and you also see some of the jank, is the popular term. But the jank comes with the territory with that kind of game.
As with Daggerfall's missing dragons, there were ideas the Morrowind team would have loved to implement, like real-time boat travel or silt striders that move naturalistically through the world, that just weren't possible given the constraints of the time. In game development, every feature comes at the cost of another.
There's a phrase that the Bethesda studio likes to bandy about, and that is that we can do anything, but we can't do everything.
As the worlds get bigger, as the players get to have more opportunities to sort of just express themselves and how they want to play and experience the game, that's kind of the core.
I have seen the gates of Oblivion, beyond which no waking eye may see.
Although wildly different from Daggerfall, The Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion offered another example of Bethesda game studios going big in response to the games that preceded it. If Morrowind could be described as Alice in Wonderland meets Dune meets the Dark Crystal, as Barry puts it, Oblivion would be the Elder Scrolls series' answers to the Lord of the Rings films. The fourth entry would aim for a wider audience, more approachable writing, and some familiar iconography, yet not without taking advantage of the fact that Oblivion could be found dead center in Tamriel's name for hell. Given the Xbox 360 era's higher polygon counts and the addition of pixel shading, but still being a scrappy studio of fewer than 50 people, Oblivion returned to procedural generation for things like rocks and trees. It also added a number of quality of life features absent from the launch version of Morrowind, including a full-fledged quest journal, waypoints, a horizontal compass, and fast travel.
So audience expectations continued to change over the years. I was a game developer for decades. And if you go way back, you find that games are extremely unforgiving. Lack of save games, the fact that you could die really, really easily, and they were very, very difficult. And in those early days, what was celebrated was mastery. I felt good because I mastered this game, because I beat it. It was me against the machine. Mm-hmm. And as the audience matured and the industry matured, it became more about telling fun stories and less about the fact that I had to be better than the software.
Oblivion was a challenging project for Bethesda for a number of reasons, not the least of which was Microsoft deciding late in the development of the Xbox 360 to ship its new console without a hard drive, which is quite a nightmare for an open-world streaming game, says Gardner. Still, Howard's notion of capitalizing on the success of Peter Jackson's Ring trilogy proved out. It became another bottled lightning moment for Bethesda, and for some, The Elder Scrolls IV remains the sweet spot. Oblivion might lack the handcrafted, richly imagined quality of Morrowind's ashen landscapes, but the tools it gave players for navigating its own province of Cyrodiil have endured ever since. And where Morrowind had relied heavily on dice rolls and under-the-hood statistics for its combat, Oblivion strove for a more intuitive and tactile style of swordplay.
Well, because it sucks to swing a sword and miss. I don't know how else to put it. Like, when you're standing in front of something, you're swinging madly, and you're hitting every third time. It feels like a bug, right? It works in top-down tactical games because you can see the dice rolls, you understand it, right? So a lot of these, or especially early games, are an attempt to mimic Dungeons and Dragons, right? So they use these mechanics, and I was like, no, it needs to be more skill-based, where you actually have to hit the thing. The funny thing is I believe even through Oblivion, we had a ray cast system where it just basically, you did the attack, there was a ray that cast out, and if the enemy was in the distance of that ray, in the front cone or something, it registered a hit. So it had nothing to do with actual collision spheres or any kind of collision on the sword or things on the character. We struggled with that.
Dropping Morrowind's dice-driven combat in favor of a more hack-and-slash approach to the action was the right move, but it presented its own unique set of problems that persisted through the two games that followed. Stunlocking was a popular complaint among players, who found that your character's hit reaction or stagger animation could leave you vulnerable for longer than it took for an opponent to start attacking again.
Just get locked, and some especially if two of them are hitting you. So what we had to do in the end, and why Skyrim's combat never felt as good as I thought it could, is because we never got those timings down, and we had to randomize the hit reactions. So that stopped the stunlock problem, but it also made it feel weird, because then all of a sudden you'd sometimes swing a sword and you'd hit, but you wouldn't see the guy flinch. So there was this weird disconnect, so the combat didn't feel very, very responsive.
Oblivion also made use of smaller bits of downloadable content players could pay for to modify their game, even on Xbox and PlayStation. We all remember the horse armor, right? If you look at Bethesda RPGs that followed, these decisions still reverberate through the Elder Scrolls series today, as well as in the franchise the company acquired in 2007, Interplay's Fallout. Fallout 3, Bethesda's open-world, fully 3D entry in a series known for its old-school isometric RPGs, had a lot to live up to, and some significant problems to solve from a design standpoint. Players knew and loved the world that Interplay and Black Isle had created. Thankfully, so did Bethesda, dating back to the studio's Redguard and Morrowind days. Howard and company fought hard to get out of ZeniMax's dusty warehouse basement and break out into the mainstream. With Fallout, they had a chance to do it again. The move from Tolkien-esque Tamriel to the irradiated rubble of post-nuclear Washington, D.C. meant figuring out how to make the first-person gunplay feel at home in a Fallout sequel.
We were operating under, and I think it was even one of the marketing taglines, that this would be Oblivion with swords. Oh, with guns, excuse me. That's kind of how we approached it. We wanted all the best things about the Elder Scrolls games, the open world, interesting character creation, lots and lots of loot and things to pick up and find. We wanted all that, but with a Fallout background.
Bethesda's solutions was V.A.T.S, or Vault Tech Assisted Targeting System. a slow motion mode you use to target specific body parts on a given enemy without having to react as quickly as you would if you were playing a shooter like Doom. It didn't require you to aim so much as make decisions, which fit with the turn-based combat of the original Fallout. Similar ideas had been used by BioWare with its dice-based Dungeons & Dragons combat for Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic. Action would play out in real time, but the player could pause, evaluate the battlefield, and issue commands.
When we made Fallout 3, we were afraid we were going to make the RPG too action-focused and turn off the RPG people, right? The people who did, that's where V.A.T.S came from, is in an attempt to make it more palatable for people who weren't skilled at Twitch comics. Forget, first-person shooters were still, they're in their heyday back then, but not everyone played them. A lot of people came out of Baldur's Gate 2 and other games that were role-playing games. That combat evolved quite a bit. First of all, first-person melee is very difficult to pull off. Some games are doing better at it now, or some games have done great at it. But at the time, it was still very difficult to pull off because you can't see 360 around. You have no idea when things are hidden from you. You're behind. You get little reticle indicators and stuff, but it's still it can be a very chaotic experience.
Ironically, he says, Bethesda largely perfected melee combat for the sequel, Fallout 4, a game in which people tend to avoid melee weapons.
With Fallout 3, we were very concerned. I think the whole team was. It was definitely a dramatic tone shift for us all across the board. There were some things that translated very nicely, but in a generic sense, in a gameplay loop type of manner. But we were extremely, extremely self-conscious and concerned with how to tonally shift from our more colorful, more atmospheric fantasy.
We weren't used to writing with modern dialogue. We weren't used to writing with something as simple as cuss words. And some of our early attempts at it were positively dreadful.
Oh, don't worry about that now. There are things to do.
And Emil Pagliarulo, who was the lead designer for Fallout 3, he really helped the dialogue along and helped us get into the modern vocabulary and how to do all that stuff and make it feel right. Because that was trickier than we'd anticipated.
You can come in, but you better not piss me off.
From a world-building standpoint, Fallout 3 was also a great challenge for the art team. Improvements in graphical fidelity had led to a huge increase in workload, so they were doing more hand-painted textures than ever before, putting in more hours per area and struggling with the limited kit pieces used to construct the environments.
Kit pieces that were chunks of rooms, this is a corner piece, this is a wall piece, and it has the whole floor and ceiling. Whereas by the time we got to 4, going through Skyrim, that started to break apart more and more, so you could have all this destruction, and every dungeon was a lot more custom that way.
He compares the process to putting together a Lego kit, which he grew up loving to do.
Hey, you're finally awake.
After the artistic and technical hurdles of Oblivion and Fallout 3, Bethesda Game Studios hit another high point with The Elder Scrolls V Skyrim, one of the most beloved games ever made. Skyrim combined the team's love of Norse mythology, low fantasy like Conan the Barbarian, and the snowy pine-laden mountainscapes of the Pacific Northwest. They sought native Scandinavian speakers to lend authenticity to the game's considerable voiceover cast, which included Christopher Plummer, Max von Sydow, and series mainstay Linda Carter. And they pushed their tools and engine to new heights, crafting the franchise's most lifelike game world to date. Nesmith and Kurt Coleman collaborated on a new kind of dynamic procedural content they dubbed the Radiant Story System, which introduced emergent quest lines based on how the players behaved in the game. The idea being that players could never truly run out of things to do in Skyrim.
I wish only an end to the fighting, so that I can tend to the temple once more.
Where Morrowind and Oblivion had emphasized NPC scheduling as a way to add verisimilitude to the respective worlds, Skyrim would stretch things even further with characters that reacted to the user in more meaningful ways.
Not to mention my great fondness for dragons and petty political power struggles.
Kurt Coleman and I worked really hard in Skyrim to redefine procedural content to try and make it feel less rote or mechanical or bland, try and make it more interesting and particular. I think we had a decent amount of success in that. But there's been a couple of times throughout all of Bethesda's games where the realization was kind of slapped in our face that, totally procedural content is not what the audience wants. There's a certain amount of procedural processes that can be acceptable and can enhance a game. But at the end of the day, those procedural elements are tools in a very large toolkit for creating fun for the player, and they are not the end-all be-all and shouldn't dominate.
This was a point in Bethesda's history when folks could focus their passions on specific things they wanted to see in the game, as with earlier titles, while taking full advantage of better hardware and a better understanding of what their creation engine was capable of. Nesmith pitched Todd Howard on the idea of overhauling the magic system, and was given a lot of leeway, along with programmer Steve Meister and some others, to revamp the way spells worked and how elements like lightning, fire, and ice behaved.
You could more or less do what you want on Skyrim. Me and Joel Burgess and Darrell Brigner, we snuck in Blackreach, basically, which is kind of a big thing to sneak in that was not on the schedule. But that's part of why I liked that era of the studios the most, because there's a lot of trust that you're putting in people then. It's like, hey, just go make something cool. That's why we hired you. Go make something interesting. Not just checking off another thing on the list.
Skyrim's crowning achievement, perhaps, was its implementation of dragons, the return of the Nords' world-destroying gods of legend, long thought dead forever. It was a Herculean technological feat with its own strike team dedicated to making the noble creatures work as intended, but it was also the realization of a dream dating back to the Daggerfall days.
Todd was all over dragons. That was something that he very, very much wanted to shepherd, and he did. And it was a big lift. It was a lot harder than we thought it was going to be, and it took a lot to get them to where they were.
Like the V.A.T.S system, Skyrim's dragons took years of steady work right up until the moment the game shipped.
Yeah, very broken for a long time, dragons flying backwards and shooting up through the ground. But that's really true for any game where it's so broken for so long, especially open world games when you have all these systems at play. But, it worked out in the end. It's just, you have to kind of have faith for a long time that it'll be fixed, but not too much faith.
At one point, for the giants, one of the values that imparted momentum upon a strike got set wrong. And so when giant hits you, you went flying. And I meant up above the clouds. You're looking down on the entire map. You see stuff you shouldn't really be able to see. And Todd and the other leads, including myself, thought that was just absolutely hysterical. And so it was no, we got to keep that in. We dialed it back to where it was a little more reasonable. But, to this day, you get hit by a giant, you go flying through the air and ragdoll to an insane amount because it was just fun to watch that happen.
This time I'm ready. Because I know war.
War never changes.
Before Skyrim went out the door, a small team was already hard at work on Fallout 4. Their concept art depicted a post-apocalyptic Boston, with its colonial US history and MIT-driven science community inspiring the retro future Commonwealth in equal measure. Percupile flew into the city and took countless photographs of Fenway Park, the real-world basis for the location he'd be spending most of his virtual time in for the next few years, Diamond City, the great green jewel of the Commonwealth.
And I feel Fallout 4, we took an important step towards not shying away from color.
Where earlier Bethesda RPGs had favored muted colors and selective palettes, the art team wanted Fallout 4 to be recognizable as a 20th century coastal cityscape, the atom bomb notwithstanding. They studied artwork from the period, and it's probably no accident that the game was in development while Mad Men aired. Naturally, it came out looking like an Edward Hopper painting. A new generation of hardware allowed for huge improvements to Bethesda's level of detail system, or LOD, which players can see in the long-distance vistas when standing atop a tall building, aboard the Pridewind airship, or along the harbor. It's certainly one of the best-looking games Bethesda Game Studios has made, down to technological leaps in performance capture, facial animation, saccadic eye rhythm, and lighting. Upwards of 40% of the game's 111,000 lines of dialogue were recorded by two actors voicing the player character, Courtney Taylor and Brian T. Delaney.
That's not true. It can't be.
Quite a change from Skyrim's silent hero.
A tough and commanding voice can get someone pretty far in the violence business.
One of the pie-in-the-sky ideas Todd Howard had for Fallout 4 early on was a settlement building system. A Sims-like diversion for players to fool around with when they're not off adventuring. It seemed likely to be too difficult, and many thought it would be the first feature to get cut. But after some experimentation, a team led by Steve Meister managed to get the building mode working, and it's a large part of Fallout 4's magic, so much so that it became the basis for Fallout 76, an online multiplayer spin-off. Looking ahead to Starfield and its emphasis on customizable spacecraft, it's easy to spot the creative lineage.
And if you look throughout all of Bethesda's games, you can start to see that it starts with being able to buy a house and own a home, which I think we did in Oblivion, and then slowly it got better and better. And actually one of the DLCs for Skyrim was something that I worked personally very hard on, which was the Hearthfire expansion to allow you to customize your house to a high degree. And then that got taken even further in Fallout 4 and then Fallout 76. So base is big deal, and customizing your spaceship is just a natural outgrowth of that.
For years, Howard daydreamed about Bethesda's space game and would talk openly about it with others in the studio, but the timing had to be right. You couldn't just knock out something of that scale, with 1,000 planets and interstellar travel, alongside a Fallout 4 or Elder Scrolls 6. In the mid to late 90s, Bethesda went so far as to announce a collaborative project with Centropolis Entertainment called The 10th Planet, which was delayed a handful of times before ultimately being cancelled. Nesmith and others worked for years on that first attempt, which had its own in-depth systems for starship customization and space combat. But it would have been closer to Bethesda's version of TIE Fighter, the popular Star Wars dogfighting sim of that era, with Earth fending off an alien invasion. The team at Bethesda is full of Star Wars fans, Howard chief among them. But Starfield has more in common with the grounded, dirt-under-the-nails future of Ridley Scott's Alien and Stanley Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey. It poses a fascinating question. If space is the final frontier, so to speak, for open-world games, at what point do all those pixels and planetary bodies begin to lose Bethesda's signature cluttered feel? Sure, Starfield looks to fit in with the studio's long tradition of single-player RPGs, from the procedural dungeons of Arena and Daggerfall to the glittering horizons of Skyrim and Fallout 4. But what's the essence of that tradition? What keeps us coming back to the worlds of the Elder Scrolls and Fallout year after year to make a new chapter and step out into the harsh light of a daunting adventure?
The big word would be freedom. Freedom to make your character the way you want to make it. You'll notice that we don't really have classes from Daggerfall on. Characters were a conglomeration of whatever attributes you wanted to assign them. That's true in the Fallout series, that's true in the Elder Scrolls series. Freedom to go where you want. Todd's very fond of saying, if you can see it, you can go there. And that you don't have to follow a storyline the way we present it to you. You know, coming out of character gen, if you want to go left rather than straight, yeah, go for it. You know, that freedom is probably the number one thing that defines a Bethesda game.
The first thing that comes to mind is world simulation and persistence. Presenting the world as though it's a real place that the player can interact with to increasingly complex degrees, and ways that then also tie back into influence and affect the actual moment-to-moment gameplay that they have, and how big of a bite they take off of what they're trying to chew. I can picture everybody's faces that I knew and conversations along the way, and they loved what they were doing, and they loved sharing that with people and gently pulling other people into that love, you know, that explorative interaction.
With the release of Starfield, Bethesda's first new universe in decades, there's a palpable excitement among a certain kind of player. Whether or not it lives up to its promise in the minds of fans or the folks who made it is not something that will be decided in a couple of days, but it's a welcome reminder, some 8 years after the launch of Fallout 4, of why we care about these games so much. Characters like Piper Wright and Preston Garvey illustrate how a Bethesda RPG is defined not just by its vast environments, but also the people who live there, and that includes the user. From the casual role player indulging their vampire lord fantasies, to the hobbyist game designer building their own custom modules with the creation kit. A new Bethesda game is only the start. Countless stories await that the developers themselves can't possibly foresee. More than any dungeon, or spell, or starship, the player is the key ingredient.
Shields ready. The rest is up to you.
For more on the final frontier, check out IGN's review of Starfield. And for everything else outer space, keep it here on IGN.